Hello, I'm Ewan Jones. I'm the Environment Officer at St George's Church. This is the second part of a video that we recorded of a training session that we ran in October and November 2020. This second part deals with ways that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to campaign and pray for others to do the same. This section was recorded live with an actual group in attendance, so you'll see me responding to things they were saying in the chat at various points during the recording. This next section is about what we can do individually and as a group, I suppose, to reduce our carbon footprint. And I wanted to start with a sort of question where you answer in the chat, what sort of things might people do to reduce their carbon footprint? I'll read out a few of the answers as they come through. Fly less. Oh, two people have basically put the same thing there. Cycle more. Solar panels. We're going to cover all these things so far. Electric cars. Wear a jumper. Very good. Yes, I like that. Use green energy. Veggie and vegan food. Wind energy. Reduce travel. Buy food produced locally. Insulate the home. Great. Okay. Turn down the heating, nuclear power, less political hot air. Now, yes, if we could harness that somehow, that would be wonderful. Right. Okay. So we're going to dive straight in. So whilst I was, just move these boxes so I can actually see what I need to on the screen. So whilst I was preparing this session, I kept thinking about what Jesus said about taking the plank out of your own eye before dealing with the speck in your own. And this is normally used as a basis to talk about hypocrisy and judgmentalism. But I think it's also about dealing with the big things first and not being distracted by the little things until the large things are dealt with. So in this session, I've tried to focus on the bigger issues, and I'll keep coming back to that point a couple of times. So a term that you may have seen is CO2 equivalent, or CO2e, as it's sometimes abbreviated. And I just wanted to explain what this is. So there are a mixture of different greenhouse gases. There are several gases that warm the climate. Each has a different potency or global warming potential. And this graph shows that methane is around 30 times as potent as CO2. David used a different figure earlier. That's just to do with the length of time it's measured over, but it's more potent. And nitrous oxide is almost 300 times as potent. So CO2 equivalent is a bit like taking lots of different currencies to a bureau de change and getting them changed into one currency so that it's easier to understand how much we have. So given that on this graph, CO2 is the least potent gas, why do we talk about it more than the others? And the answer is because we emit so much more of it that most of the global warming we see is caused by CO2. This pie chart is for the UK, and it shows that the CO2 is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, even taking account of their different potencies. So it's a weighted chart we're looking at. So in the UK, the average carbon footprint can be divided into these categories. Each of our carbon footprints will be a bit different to this, but for the rest of this talk, I'm going to work through each section of the pie chart and look at ways that we can reduce our carbon emissions in each area. So the first section on that pie chart is energy use in the home. So this pie chart shows a typical breakdown of the carbon emissions from using energy, normally in the form of gas and electricity in our houses. Clearly, heating is an important issue, so that's where we should be focusing. It's the plank rather than the speck. So don't get too distracted by obsessively unplugging a phone charger that's using half a watt when you're possibly sat in a t-shirt with the heating on. Focus on the plank rather than the speck. So I'll move into what we can do specifically in a moment, but I wanted to take a brief diversion here to talk about where our electricity comes from. This graph shows how the source of our electricity in the UK has changed over the last 100 years. Over this time, most of the electricity has come from 3 fossil fuels: coal, oil, and gas, shown in grey, and gases in pink. Demand has fallen over the last few years, but what we can see, if we look at the vertical end of this graph here for 2020, we can see that we're now getting less than half of our electricity from those 3 fossil fuels. Part of that is because demand has fallen over the last few years, and part of that is also because wind energy particularly, but also solar, has increased very rapidly in that time. So the carbon emissions from the electricity we use have approximately halved in the last 5 years, and most people aren't even aware that this has happened. One of the effects of this is that it is now lower carbon to use electricity than gas. So Izzy and I recently changed our gas cooker to an electric induction cooker, and because that's the most efficient and lowest carbon option now. There's also an app which I get slightly obsessed with. That's what this picture is. There's a link at the bottom, and it gives live updates on the minute-by-minute changes of what's happening on our electricity grid. Now, you may have noticed it's very windy outside. So right now, wind is giving us 26% of our electricity across the country, and it's about the peak time, peak demand, I should say, about 5 in the evening. Gas is giving us 36%. The sun's gone down, so we're not getting any from that, but there's no coal running at all. There's never any oil anymore. Burning wood or biomass is giving us 4%, and nuclear about 15%, and there's a few other smaller sources in there as well. So the next 3 slides, I'm going to talk about steps that we can take to reduce home energy use. First slide will be things that are free, and then things that are low cost, and then things that are higher cost. So this slide shows some things that we can do for free. Dealing with the largest home energy use, turning down the heating by 1 degree typically saves about 10% off our heating bill. So if we can take other steps to keep warm, then it can make a big difference. So dressing warmly, someone mentioned wearing a jumper, or having a blanket on the sofa. Other things that use a lot of energy are things that get things hot, basically. So heating water for washing, so washing at a cooler temperature, or having a shower that uses less hot water than a hot bath. They can save a lot of energy at 0 cost. In the kitchen, one big thing that we can do is to keep the lids on pans as much as possible. If we boil a pan of water with the lid off on full heat, it'll use about twice as much energy as boiling it gently with the lid on. But in both cases, the water is at 100 degrees C, so the food will cook at the same speed. So low-cost measures, these typically cost from a few pounds up to a few £100. In the kitchen, fridges and freezers are on all the time, so it's worth checking that we've got an efficient model and replacing them if they're not. Microwaving food is generally the most efficient way of cooking. It obviously only works for certain things. Izzy and I use a microwave steamer like the one in this picture with broccoli in it. We use it to cook vegetables and rice, and it's very easy to use, and the rice never sticks. LED lighting technology is improving very rapidly and is available for almost every type of light fitting. So a simple thing to do is to switch LED bulbs in whenever an old bulb goes, or perhaps sooner if it's a particularly high energy bulb. A simple thing to do is to switch to a renewable electricity tariff, but there is a pitfall with this. If you think back to a couple of slides ago, you'll remember that less than half of our electricity now comes from fossil fuels. So many electricity companies rather sneakily take the view that so long as less than half the electricity they sell is going to customers on a renewable tariff, then they don't really need to change anything. Which magazine wrote an article on this, which you can read using the link above. It's free to access. Their basic conclusion was that the two companies that I've put the logos for here are definitely making a positive difference by using their customers' payments to invest in new renewable installations. For some of the other companies, it was far from clear that that's what they were doing. And for some of them, it was pretty clear that wasn't what they were doing. There are also some low-cost ways to insulate our homes. For example, topping up loft insulation or cavity wall insulation. The recommended depth for loft insulation is between 30 and 40 centimetres. And I'm happy to talk about cavity wall insulation or any other form of insulation if you want to get in touch. I should have said, for those of you who don't know, I'm a consultant engineer and I work in energy efficiency, so I spend a lot of my time talking about these things through the week. So finally, moving on to the higher cost measures. These will typically cost a few £1,000s. The man in blue down here is actually my dad, and he stood right behind where I'm now sat, or he was. He's not there right now. We're fitting internal wall insulation, and we've done this in the whole house. So our house has got solid brick walls rather than cavity walls. And it's now, what are we, the middle of November, and we've still not turned the heating on, although I suspect it won't be long. There are two, well, I've lost my place in my notes. So there's also, as well as internal wall insulation, there's external wall insulation, which is shown in this picture, and it can have a rendered finish or be made to look like brickwork. We can also consider renewable technologies for our houses. Air source heat pumps, like this one, use electricity to take heat from the air to give use for heating and hot water. And there are also two types of solar panel that we might consider, ones that generate electricity and another that generates hot water. And again, I'm very happy to talk about these in more detail if you're interested. The links at the bottom, I've put 3 links here. One is a blog that I've written about how we're insulating our house, where you'll find that picture and lots of other notes on that topic. And then the other 2 relate to a government grant scheme that is currently running that's offering up to £5,000 or £10,000 if you're on certain benefits. And that's to go towards energy efficiency measures or some renewable technologies as well. The second link the second link is to a helpful webinar, which is explaining about this scheme. And the third of those links is the government's own website on that topic. It's worth saying that that scheme expires in March, and there's been a massive rush to make use of it. I think there's governments under a fair amount of pressure to extend that deadline, but I'm not sure if they have yet. Although there's announcements coming this week. So moving on to the next section of the pie chart, land transport. So this photo shows the difference in the amount of space that 200 people take up in different forms of transport. The graphic is really a comment on road space, but the same logic applies to energy and carbon dioxide. The typical car occupancy is around 1.5 people. So each person is typically pulling around a ton of metal with them wherever they go, which isn't a very efficient way to move around. The bar graph shows the carbon dioxide equivalent per person kilometre. So the emissions from a car are improved as the occupancy increases. Hence the benefit of car sharing. Public transport is the ultimate car share, but average bus occupancy across the UK is still pretty low, very much so at the moment. So the average emissions can be quite high, but it's still better than going in a car on your own. Trains are greener than a full car, and for the reasons I mentioned earlier, an electric vehicle is a lower emission option as well. And of course, walking and cycling are zero carbon, so they're always the best option if it's possible. It's also important to consider if the journey we're about to take is necessary or whether it could be combined with another trip to somewhere in the same vicinity. Most carbon-intensive form of transport is flying. This graph shows the carbon emissions per kilometre, but of course, when we're flying, we're also usually covering a very large distance in one go. So moving on to flights. So because of this, emissions from flying are a big part of the average person's footprint. Some people may not fly at all, and some will obviously fly more than average. The typical annual flight for a UK resident is approximately 1 return flight to Turkey or 4 return flights to Amsterdam, which is not that far away. But notice that in one trip, we can easily emit more carbon than from all the rest of our transport for the year. So looking at the pie chart at the bottom there. There are other ways, of course, that we can leave the country. The table here is taken from a really useful website called Seat 61, which is all about train travel, mostly in Europe, but also further afield. And we can also take holidays in the UK, and I think we're really blessed to live in a country with such diverse landscapes and so many different things to see. And I think this year that's, well, a lot of people have rediscovered that, I guess. So moving on to the next section of the pie chart then. Our food system is quite complicated, and there are lots of interactions between the different elements such as land use and the other things I've listed out in this graphic. So I'm going to focus on the big issues on the next 3 slides. So this is a helpful diagram that the BBC produced based on some recent scientific research. It shows a range of carbon emissions per portion for some different foods. It shows a range in each case. So taking beef as an example, high impact beef might be grazed on deforested rainforest land in South America and then flown to the UK. Low impact might be fed purely on fresh grass and travelled just a few miles to get to us. One clear trend from this diagram, though, is that all the meats are generally towards the top, with dairy products in the middle and vegetables towards the bottom. One of the reasons that beef and lamb are at the top is because these animals produce methane from the way their digestive systems work. You may remember that methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas. So reducing the amount of meat, particularly beef and lamb, can make a really big difference. So food transport. As with transporting ourselves, there is a big difference in the CO2 emissions for the different ways we transport food or other goods. Flying comes out much higher than other options. Transporting food by ship is a much more efficient but slower way to do it. So if the food is perishable and it comes from a long way away, then it's very likely to have come by plane and less likely to have come by ship. One exception to this is bananas, which ripen on their way and so do generally come by boat. At this point, I'd like to just take a brief diversion to mention a book that we used quite a lot in the preparation of this. It's called How Bad Are Bananas?, which is obviously a play on the point I just made. The subtitle, A Carbon Footprint of Everything, and it's by a guy called Mike Berners-Lee. And if anyone wants to put in the chat what Mike Berners-Lee's brother is famous for, then I will deliver a free banana to the person who can get there first. And Izzy's going to monitor the chat and work out who that was. Ooh, Angie got there. Angie got there. Okay. A free banana. So, where am I? So one of the things that Izzy and I do to help navigate through this is to get a veg box from this company called Riverford, who guarantee that they won't air freight anything. And that reduces the amount of time spent reading labels in a supermarket. So the third area I wanted to go on to is food waste. And this statistic really shocked me. Around 30% of our food is wasted on average in the UK and much of the Western world. And if we stop that across Europe and the USA, then we could feed the world 3 times over, which is just shocking. But we're still cutting down forests to produce more food. So reducing food waste can make a big difference. So moving on to goods and services, and this is actually the biggest section of the pie chart. And this is everything we buy, including things like financial services. So if you look around the rooms that you're in, almost everything there has a carbon footprint from its production and getting it to you. As an example, a car, not that I'm suggesting you're in a room with a car, but it's not zero carbon if we don't use it. Just buying it has caused CO2 emissions from the extraction of the minerals, the smelting of the metals, the assembly, and so on. But the typical car is in use for less than 5% of the time that we own it. This one has had the road resurfaced around it. So what could we do to use less stuff? If you want to type things in the chat. Oh, Angie doesn't like bananas. Oh dear. We've done this 3 times now. No one's wanted the banana. Buy second hand. Okay. Clothing is a big one. Buy less. I assume you mean wear clothes, make them last for longer rather than wearing less, because then you need the heating on. Sharing things, yeah. Reuse last year's clothes. No fast. Izzy's commenting on my fashion sense now. No fast fashion. Repair as much as possible. These are all good answers. Learn to knit and sew. I think I've seen you knitting on some Zoom call at some point, Angie. Have I imagined that? Okay. Those are great answers. Here's a list that I came up with. Nudism. Right, okay, we're stopping this line of discussion now. So this is the list that we came up with, and there's lots of other things that we could do as well. There's a useful website at the bottom here that explores a lot of the issues in this particular area. Right, so one thing I wanted to focus on is particularly financial services. So when we put our money into a bank account or any other investment like a pension, then that institution is using our money, and they could be investing it in a coal mine or a wind turbine or anything. But it is possible to choose financial products that make green investments. And there's some useful websites that have put links here to that you might want to look at as well. It's worth saying all the links are on the St. George's Resource website, so we'll give you a link to one place, as are these slides as well. So this is just a collection of a few of the resources and references we've made during the part of the session. I wanted just to highlight 3 different carbon calculator tools that you might like to look at. They all work in slightly different ways, asking different questions to try and get to the same answer. So some of them rely more on having bank statements and an idea of what you spend different amounts of money on. Some of them are more qualitative in the questions that they ask. The bottom one particularly is very focused on goods and services, and asks a lot of interesting questions around that. So I wanted to talk a bit more about campaigning and prayer as well. So we've talked about several sections of the pie chart, and we can achieve a lot as individuals, but there are some things outside of our direct control, and we can campaign and pray about these things. So again, in the chat, what sort of things could we pray for, or should we campaign for, and which groups or organizations should we be directing our campaigns towards? No one's typing anything. Okay. Oh, here we go. Campaign for better electric charging infrastructure for cars. Yeah. Okay. This is really about moving us from these blue lines that Izzy mentioned earlier down to the green one at the bottom. Supporting Greenpeace with a question mark. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to do. Local diocese and government. And coming quickly now, enabling electric car use for people living in high density population areas. Responsible use of resources by government, both national and local. Yeah, these are all great. Okay. So I wanted to draw your attention to a few different things. So the UN, United Nations, holds regular conferences on climate change, and the next one is going to be in Glasgow next year. It was meant to be about now, but was postponed for obvious reasons. The host country tends to have a disproportionate influence on the conference and the negotiations, and sets the tone by showing what that host country is doing. And this time it's us. So right now, campaigning in the UK particularly has a bigger effect than it did before. And the links on this slide give some information about different ways that we can add our voice to the discussions. One particular thing is there's an announcement this week from Boris Johnson about different environmental policies that he's launching or announcing. And I think that may be linked to this to some extent, because countries are meant to submit their plans for carbon reduction by the end of this year, by the 31st of December. So it's particularly good time to be writing to MPs and so on. So there's a few more campaigns here. You may recognize some of the people in this picture. John Swales has done a lot on campaigning, particularly in the last year or so, 18 months. So you can get in touch with him if you want to know more about the different things he's been doing. I'm assured that this picture was a campaign against investments that Barclays was making and nothing to do with Greg's. Writing to MPs and councillors is another effective way to show them what priorities the electorate have. And then also something that is easy to forget is writing to the companies that we buy goods and services from. So there's petitions you can sign, or just write directly to them. They'll all have contact details to ask them about what their environmental policies are in a particular area. You may have heard of the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, shortened to CEE bill, and it's a private member's bill in the House of Parliament, which has been written by top scientists, but it needs a broad parliamentary support if it's going to succeed. And at the moment, I think the last I heard, there were around 80 MPs that support it, which is a lot, but it's not enough. So writing to MPs on that topic is a helpful thing to do. And actually the other petition, I think that, I don't know the current latest on this actually. This was current when we first presented this talk, but there was a coal mine in Cumbria that was given approval by the local council, but central government has or had the option to stop it. And I have a look at that petition. Izzy's trying to find out the latest. I will give you an update on that if we can find out. But yeah, it seems crazy given everything we've just said to approve a new coal mine. So we all have, as well as all of those things, we have influence over our families, our friends, people we work with or study with, the ways we spend our money and the ways we vote. And it's helpful to remember that when we're interacting with different groups or organizations or individuals in all our different fields of influence. So we're planning some follow-up sessions where we're going to talk through each of these topics in more detail. I'm aware that we rattled through a lot in quite a short space of time. David Kibble's already, I think, pretty well finished preparing a session on food. which is a topic he's really, almost without thinking, I was going to say got his teeth into. He's got really enthused on it and has prepared a talk. So that will be coming. I think we're planning that for January. I've been talking to a lot of people one-to-one about energy use in the home, and I'm very happy to do that with anyone who wants to get in touch. We're planning another session on goods and services, and prayer, and also we're trying to get someone to do a session on the theology around the topic as well. So that's my church email address, which they've given me as part of the role of being environment officer. So do feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions or comments. There's a survey that we sent out to people who attended the previous 2 sessions, and we found that feedback really helpful. So we'll send you a link to that as well. So now we're going to go into the second and final breakout rooms. Izzy's put questions in the chat. I say Izzy has, it appears with my name. So if I open the breakout rooms again, this should put you in the same rooms you were in before.